Thanks, Stan. Good evening, Dr. Lutz. Thanks for joining us on InFocus.
You're welcome.
When we think terrorism, we often think 9/11, but your research shows that terrorism existed in America long before 9/11. Can you begin by talking about that?
Well, one of the classic terrorist groups in the United States was the Ku Klux Klan in its first manifestation after the Civil War, which clearly was actually a very successful terrorist group in that they changed the style of governments in the American South and put basically the old governing elite back in power. There was the Red Scare after World War I, which was actually, there were a very real threat and a whole series of anarchist bombings and Puerto Rican nationalists and white supremacists and a whole series of attacks against minority groups, which in some ways can be considered terrorism because they were trying to drive out Hispanics or Chinese or whomever. So the United States has a fairly long history in its short history of terrorist actions, and then it even goes back to the American Revolution because all the events leading up to the Boston Tea Party were property terrorism.
With all of that said, we've heard now that the war on terror is officially over. Is that fair to say, in your opinion?
Well, I think the war in Iraq may be officially over. The war on terror will never, well, it can be officially over because some official says so, but in a broader sense, a war on terror, you'll never be able in the immediate future to completely eliminate terror and terrorism. The best you can do is contain it and keep it at much more manageable levels. So the fact that somebody might suggest that it's over, I would, no, it's not over.
Interesting. This latest war on terror that we're talking about tonight has resulted in the labeling, the stereotyping of many different groups of people. How do we move past that now as a society?
I think that's going to be very difficult because, for one thing, there will always be at least some politicians, not necessarily a huge number, but some that will play upon the fears of the voters in order to get themselves elected, and they will find it advantageous to exacerbate the differences rather than to reduce them. And unfortunately, it seems to be the case that the individuals who are focusing upon the threat, which isn't as real as it might be, are much more often heard than the persons who are not.
Now, Dr. Lutz, I wish we had more time, but I'm afraid that's all the time we have for this evening. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Back to you, Stan.
Thanks, Sarah. I wanted to ask each of you a question about some of the unknown effects of war. Lieutenant Colonel White, we'll start with you. I want to talk about the way a military changes based on the war it is fighting. Are there some ways people might not realize that the actual fighting forces are kind of morphing as the conflict goes along?
Yeah, it's an interesting challenge for us because, after all, we're an armed force and we train to do armed intervention. And in a counterinsurgency, we have to switch gears. And we're in the best situation when we don't have to use lethal force and kinetic weapons. The perfect situation when we're in trying to rebuild a country is to be in a situation where we can truly work day to day with the people, be among them, embrace their culture, and that's difficult to switch an infantry unit, for example, to switch out of their paradigm of using lethal force, and instead, and really this is what makes the National Guard a positive force in this, because we have such broad civilian backgrounds. But you really have to think about when you're in a community or a province that it's like your own, and how would you want to be treated if you were in this situation, and treat others as though you'd like to be treated, and you're able to embrace the population and build a country a lot better that way.
Dr. Fiedler, what about the ways that laws or policies changed? You mentioned some confusion regarding the midterm elections just a few weeks ago. What about the ways that people are looking at how we move forward in terms of legislatively or on the policy side?
Well, there are a lot of implications with regards to the nature of the war, particularly in Afghanistan now, that are creating, I think, a lot of very serious policy choices that also involve legal questions, and they're the type of questions that usually don't come up in armed conflicts. I'll just give you an example of that in terms of how the laws of war apply. In the context of counterinsurgency, as Kirk has pointed out, the idea here is to use less kinetic force. And so we don't bump up against some of the issues that we've run into in previous armed conflicts about the use of kinetic force. What we're starting to see with regards to some of those controversies is the use of different type of technologies, and here I think the best example of that is the use of the drone attacks in the Afghan-Pakistan border area. This is creating a lot of issues and controversy with regards to how the United States looks at the rules of war in this new context. I think going forward, one of the questions that's out there is whether our experience and the capabilities and skills that we've developed over the course of fighting the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, where do we next deploy these skill sets? It isn't exactly clear where we're going to have the need to deploy both our civilian assets and our military forces trained for this new type of warfare in the next war. So a lot of people fear that we're actually producing a force, training a force now to fight the last war, as opposed to looking forward to the types of conflicts we might see in the future.
And Dr. Shirani, what about the culture? How does war affect the culture, not just in the place where the war is fought, but also in a place like South Central Indiana, which is sending people over to that war? And what about the way that it's recorded for posterity as well?
Well, part of the problem, I think, in this war and having to do with counterinsurgency and other issues has to do with the fact that we don't have a very well-defined enemy. The enemy is really abstract and only a concept. Who exactly are the enemy? Who are the Taliban? And we know that there are things happening under that name. We don't know who really are there doing the kinds of things that we need to fight. And that's, I think, part of the problem. The fact that we don't know where the enemy is, who really the enemies, and who our friends are, who our partners are. The partners that maybe your partner today could turn against you, and it has happened repeatedly, both in Iraq and in Afghanistan. The very definition culturally of who is your partner and who is your enemy, who is your friend, is part of the sort of problem of defining culturally of this particular kind of warfare at this time. And who is going to be the victor in a war where you don't know who your enemy is? But there are lots of things being written and victory being claimed by the other side, particularly. And there is this sense on the United States or coalition forces that they may not win this war. And that has particular kind of cultural implications as well here in the United States, unfortunately.
Thank you for that. I want to get back over to Sarah Whitmire in the radio studio with her second guest. Sarah?